The sanctuary was packed that Sunday morning, filled with the usual warmth of handshakes, hymns, and hallelujahs. But something about Pastor Elias Monroe felt off. His tie was crooked. His hands trembled slightly as he turned the pages of his Bible. And when he began to preach, his voice cracked, not with emotion but with fear. Outside, the sky was overcast, pressing down on the small North Carolina town like a secret waiting to burst. Inside the church, as Elias spoke of truth and salvation, two plainclothes officers slipped through the back entrance. They didn't need directions. They knew exactly where to go. The office behind the altar was modest, save for the heavy steel coffer tucked beneath a shelf of old hymnals. They opened it slowly, expecting financial records. What they found was far more damning. Polaroids, crumpled receipts, a shattered phone, and a handwritten note folded into a plastic bag. 6 words, scribbled in panic. If I disappear, it wasn't suicide. 3 weeks later, a decomposing body surfaced near the banks of Cedarfield Lake. The town's beloved pastor wasn't just grieving, he was hiding something, and the story behind it would dismantle everything the church thought it believed. Before you dive into this story that will shake your faith in the truth, subscribe to the channel and activate the bell. Here, we reveal cases that few have the courage to tell. Don't miss the next secret. Join the community seeking justice, one real story at a time. Pastor Elias Monroe had always known how to fill a room, not with noise, but with presence. At 47, he carried himself with the kind of quiet authority that drew people in. His sermons weren't loud or theatrical, they were calm, deliberate, and deeply personal. People said he had a way of making you feel like he was talking just to you. That gift had made New Bethel Baptist Church the fastest-growing congregation in the region over the last decade. Born and raised in Greensboro, North Carolina, Elias was the son of a factory worker and a Sunday school teacher. He was the first in his family to graduate college, attending seminary on scholarship. By his early 30s, he'd married Ruth, his high school sweetheart, and taken over as senior pastor of New Bethel. Together, they had 2 children, both now in college. From the outside, the Monroes were the embodiment of faith, discipline, and Southern grace. Elias' days were a rhythm of consistency. Morning devotionals, church meetings, hospital visits, Wednesday night Bible study, Sunday sermons, and always a warm meal waiting at home where Ruth would greet him with a tired smile and quiet pride. He was respected, admired, even envied by some, but very few knew the weight he carried behind closed doors. Though he often spoke of peace and spiritual clarity, Elias himself hadn't felt either in years. The expectations never stopped. From the community, from Ruth, from God. He lived under a microscope, with every choice scrutinized, every word recorded. And in that pressure, something had started to crack. It began subtly. Sleepless nights, longer hours at the church, a tendency to linger in the sanctuary after everyone had gone home. Ruth noticed, of course, but chalked it up to exhaustion. She didn't ask questions. Elias was grateful for that. Then came the music ministry auditions. That's when Lucas Rivera walked in. Young, gifted, and full of charm, Lucas had an easy confidence and a soulful voice that immediately caught Elias's attention. But it wasn't just his talent. There was something else, something Elias didn't understand, didn't want to name. A feeling that made him uncomfortable, curious, drawn in. He told himself it was mentorship, guidance, helping a young man find his way in faith. But deep down, Elias knew it was more. Their first few interactions were innocent, short conversations after rehearsal, encouragement, scripture. But as weeks passed, the moments grew longer, more personal. And with each exchange, Elias felt a piece of his carefully built world begin to shift. Still, he clung to his image. The godly man, the devoted husband, the leader. He thought he could control it. He had no idea how wrong he was. Elias Munro had built his life on structure, on certainty. Every sermon, every prayer circle, every fundraiser was scheduled, predictable, safe. He'd spent years perfecting that image, the wise counselor, the spiritual anchor, the faithful husband. And yet, behind that carefully cultivated persona, something restless had begun to grow. What Elias wanted, what he feared to admit even in the privacy of his own mind, was escape. Not from his family or congregation directly, but from the box he had been placed in, and the one he had helped build. He was tired of being revered, tired of performing virtue, tired of the silence in his soul. He wanted to feel something real again. That longing took shape slowly, like fog creeping in over a lake at dawn. It wasn't lust, not at first. It was attention, conversation, laughter that didn't come from obligation. Lucas Rivera offered him that, unintentionally at first. The young man was energetic, disarming and oddly perceptive. He noticed when Elias looked tired. He asked questions no one else dared. "Do you ever get lonely in leadership?" Lucas had asked once, and Elias had laughed it off, then thought about it for hours afterward. Lucas had moved to the area 6 months earlier to care for his grandmother after her stroke. A part-time music teacher and volunteer vocalist, he'd been encouraged by a neighbor to visit New Bethel. From the first Sunday he attended, his voice, smooth, expressive, heartfelt, captured the attention of the congregation. Elias approached him after service, complimenting his talent and encouraging him to join the worship team. That was how it started. Rehearsals, casual chats in the church courtyard, texts about song selections. But there was something unspoken between them from the beginning, something that neither dared to acknowledge. The connection deepened in quiet increments. One night, after a particularly moving rehearsal, Elias asked Lucas to stay back and talk. They sat in the pews, the sanctuary dark, except for a few flickering candles left from evening prayer. They spoke for over an hour. About loss, about calling, about doubt. Elias found himself revealing things he had never said aloud, not even to Ruth. "I don't know who I am outside of this robe," Elias confessed quietly. Lucas didn't judge. He listened. He understood. For Elias, that night marked a turning point. The connection felt intoxicating, not just emotionally, but spiritually. He felt seen, not as a pastor, not as a husband, but as a man. As Elias, he convinced himself it was a blessing, a second chance at understanding, a bond God had placed in his life to remind him of humanity, of vulnerability, of love in its rawest form. He reasoned that there was nothing wrong in talking, nothing sinful in friendship. But every time Lucas smiled at him that certain way, Elias felt the edges of his self-control fray. Soon the lines began to blur. They started meeting outside the church, at coffee shops 2 towns over, in quiet corners of bookstores, at late-night walks around the park near the lake. Elias never told Ruth. He never had to. He told himself it was harmless, just conversation, just mentorship. But the way his heart raced when Lucas touched his shoulder said otherwise. He lived for those meetings, for the way Lucas looked at him, not as a symbol, but as someone flawed and fascinating. Elias knew it couldn't last. He told himself every time would be the last, but it never was. The longer it continued, the more impossible it became to walk away. Lucas, for his part, seemed equally conflicted. There were moments when he would pull away emotionally, become distant, then return days later with a smile and a new worship song suggestion. Elias sensed a storm brewing in the young man, something simmering just beneath the surface. But Elias didn't ask. He didn't want to break the illusion. Instead, he prayed, desperately, repeatedly. He begged God to give him strength, to guide his heart, to deliver him from temptation. But nothing changed. And secretly, Elias feared the truth. He didn't want deliverance. He wanted more. It was a Wednesday evening when Lucas first showed signs that something had shifted. After rehearsal, he avoided eye contact, muttered a rushed goodbye, and left before Elias could say a word. That silence lingered in the sanctuary like smoke. Elias stood at the edge of the stage, watching the door close behind him, his stomach turning with an emotion he couldn't quite name. Fear, maybe, or guilt. The next day, Elias texted. No reply. Then again. Still nothing. By Friday, Lucas responded with a single sentence. We need to talk. They met in the back corner of a quiet cafe, 30 minutes outside town. Lucas looked different, colder, more guarded. He sat with his arms crossed, his usual warmth absent. I can't keep doing this, he said, eyes fixed on the table. Elias tried to keep his voice steady. Doing what? This, hiding, pretending like I don't matter once Sunday comes. Elias's jaw tightened. You do matter, Lucas. More than you know. Then why do I feel like a secret? Lucas's voice cracked, emotion leaking through his restraint. I know what this is to you. I'm not stupid. I see the way you switch off as soon as we're near other people, like you're scared of being near me. I'm scared of losing everything, Elias said quietly. My family, my church, my entire life. Lucas looked away, jaw clenched. And what do I lose, Elias? I don't have a pulpit. I don't have a wife to go home to. I just have you. And I'm starting to think I was wrong about what that meant. It was the beginning of a rift that would only widen. Lucas started withdrawing more often, missing rehearsals, ignoring texts, refusing to meet. When they did speak, it was clipped and tense. Elias felt the walls closing in. He couldn't focus on sermons. His prayer life had dried up. Ruth began asking questions. And then, one Sunday morning, a deacon approached him with a hushed concern. One of the younger choir members said they saw you and Lucas in the church parking lot, late, just the two of you. Elias brushed it off with a chuckle, but his heart pounded against his ribcage like a warning bell. That afternoon, he drove to Lucas's apartment. The confrontation was heated. Lucas accused him of manipulation, of leading him on without the courage to be honest. Elias denied it, pleaded with him to be patient, to let him figure things out. But Lucas had reached his breaking point. I'm not your dirty little secret anymore, he said. Either you acknowledge me, or I'll make sure the world does. The threat wasn't shouted. It wasn't dramatic. It was quiet, direct, inevitable. Elias left that day with his head spinning. He knew Lucas wasn't bluffing, and worse, he didn't blame him. What started as a secret became a burden. What felt like escape now felt like a trap. He began to unravel. He deleted messages, avoided phone calls, buried himself in church business to maintain the illusion. But his sermons grew hollow, his gaze more distant. Ruth asked if he was sick. Elias said it was stress. He was lying. Because, late at night, he stared at his phone, rereading old messages from Lucas, wondering how something so meaningful had become a threat. He didn't sleep. He didn't eat. He prayed for a way out, for a solution that didn't come. And then one day, an envelope arrived at the church office. No return address. Inside, a photo of Elias and Lucas sitting far too close at the lake, a receipt from a motel an hour outside town, and a sticky note with one word written in red ink, decide. That's when the real fear began. Elias had been juggling desire and duty. Now he was juggling survival. The moment Elias opened the envelope, he knew the path he had been walking had finally reached its edge. For weeks, he had managed to keep everything barely contained, his marriage, his ministry, his secret. But this was no longer a private storm. The photos, the receipts, the note, it was a declaration. Lucas wasn't just angry anymore. He was ready to set fire to everything Elias had built. That Sunday, Elias stood before his congregation preaching about forgiveness, while sweat dripped from his brow. The words came out disjointed, robotic. He couldn't focus. All he could hear was the whisper of exposure in the back of his mind. After service, as he shook hands at the church door, Deacon Frank Holloway gave him a strange look. Not suspicious, but uncertain. Something in Elias's face must have betrayed him. "Everything all right, Pastor?" Frank asked, gripping Elias's shoulder just a second too long. Elias forced a smile. "Of course, just a long week." But it wasn't just one week. It was every day unraveling. That evening, Lucas texted, "You have until Friday. After that, it's public." Elias panicked. He didn't sleep. He called Lucas. No answer. He drove by his apartment. Lights off. Silence. By Thursday, desperation took over. He withdrew $5,000 from the church's discretionary fund and met Lucas in a parking lot near the old train station. The night was humid, the air thick with tension. Lucas leaned against his car, arms crossed. "I didn't ask for money," he said flatly. Elias handed over the envelope anyway. "Take it, please. Just give me time." Lucas took it but didn't move. "This isn't about money, Elias. It's about truth." Elias's voice cracked. "Then what do you want from me?" Lucas stepped closer. "I want you to stop pretending. I want you to admit that what we had meant something. That I wasn't just a mistake." "You weren't," Elias whispered. "You're not. Then why are you treating me like a problem to fix?" That question lingered in the air. Elias couldn't answer it. Lucas walked away that night, envelope in hand, but the tension didn't lift. It deepened. Now Elias had opened the door to blackmail, and Lucas had leverage. The payments began, first weekly, then sporadic, increasing each time. Elias covered them with fabricated expenses, altered budget sheets, and quiet cash withdrawals. But it didn't take long for suspicion to spread. The church treasurer noticed discrepancies. Frank Holloway asked questions. Ruth, once patient, now questioned every late-night meeting and unexplained bank transaction. Then, during a board meeting, someone brought up the issue directly. "There's money missing," said one of the elders, "and no paper trail. Pastor, do you know anything about this?" Elias fumbled. He blamed a clerical error, promised to look into it. But the room had shifted. The trust had cracked. That same night, Ruth confronted him. "I need to ask you something," she said, standing in the kitchen doorway. "Is there someone else?" The words hit like a hammer. Elias's instinct was to deny it. But when he opened his mouth, nothing came out. His silence answered for him. Ruth didn't cry. She didn't scream. She simply walked away, closing their bedroom door behind her with a quiet finality that said everything. The next day, Lucas showed up at the church. Not in secret. Not at night. In broad daylight. He walked straight into Elias's office, smiling, as if they were old friends catching up. Elias panicked, slamming the door shut behind him. "What are you doing here?" Lucas shrugged. "Just visiting. Thought we could talk." "You can't be here, people will see." "Maybe that's the point." That moment marked the beginning of Elias's true unraveling. He became erratic, missing appointments, stumbling through sermons, avoiding eye contact with the congregation. People whispered. Attendance dropped. Then came the breaking point. An anonymous tip sent directly to Deacon Holloway's home address. Inside, printed copies of text messages between Elias and Lucas, screenshots of bank transfers, and a photo of the motel room receipt. Frank didn't sleep that night. By morning, he had contacted a private investigator. By the end of the week, Lucas had disappeared. No one saw him at rehearsal. He didn't answer his phone. His apartment door remained locked, his mailbox overflowing. At first, people assumed he'd left town, but his brother Marcus knew better. "Lucas would never leave without telling me," he told police. "Something's wrong." A missing persons report was filed. Elias was interviewed, briefly, formally, and without accusation. He claimed not to have seen Lucas in weeks, claimed they'd had a falling out. But something in his tone raised flags. Detective Caroline Briggs was assigned the case, and she didn't like inconsistencies, especially from men who looked like they had everything to lose. When Lucas Rivera vanished, the air in the town thickened. Rumors started in whispers, between pews, in grocery store aisles, at gas stations, and quickly gained speed. No one said Elias Monroe's name out loud at first, but everyone was thinking it. His absence from the pulpit that following Sunday only fueled the fire. The associate pastor covered with a generic sermon on patience and faith, but the congregation wasn't fooled. They looked to the front row where Ruth Monroe usually sat. That seat, too, was empty. At Lucas's apartment, his brother Marcus stood outside, pacing, holding a photograph of the two of them from Christmas the year before. He told the police everything he knew about the late-night calls, the emotional spirals, the mysterious older man Lucas never named. He suspected it was someone from the church, but Lucas had refused to confirm. He was protecting someone, Marcus believed, and now he was gone. Detective Caroline Briggs sat in her car for a long time after interviewing Elias for the first time. His story was neat, too neat. He said they'd had a disagreement over musical direction, that Lucas had taken things too personally, that he hadn't seen him since. He spoke with a strained calm that didn't sit right with her. Briggs had seen this before. People with too much to lose often spun the tightest lies. The impact of the disappearance sent cracks through the church community. Some members refused to believe the rumors. Others demanded answers. Attendance dropped, donations slowed, and the board called an emergency meeting. One Ruth attended alone. She sat quietly as the room debated. Financial inconsistencies, whispers of scandal. An associate pastor stepped in awkwardly, saying they should wait for the investigation before making assumptions, but assumptions had already taken root. After the meeting, Ruth walked alone to her car. She sat in the driver's seat for 20 minutes, gripping the wheel but not starting the engine. Her world was collapsing in silence. Back home, Elias was a shell. He barely spoke. He barely ate. At night, he stared out the window at the empty street, like he was waiting for something, or someone. When Ruth finally confronted him again, her voice was steady. "Did you hurt him?" His eyes didn't move. His mouth stayed shut. That was all the answer she needed. The next morning, she was gone. No note, just her side of the closet emptied, and her wedding ring left on the nightstand. Elias sat on the edge of the bed for hours, unable to cry, only able to feel the absence. Meanwhile, Marcus started his own search. He went to Lucas's friends, tracked his last known locations, posted online, handed out flyers. His desperation turned into determination. The police were doing what they could, but it wasn't enough. Detective Briggs dug deeper into Elias's financial records. She found the unusual withdrawals, the missing church funds, the discrepancy between what was logged and what was spent. She requested surveillance footage from gas stations and parking lots near the church. Then she found it, grainy but clear enough. Elias and Lucas together. After dark, arguing. A hand on a shoulder, a flinch. It wasn't proof, but it was something. She returned to New Bethel, not for a formal interview, but to watch. She stood in the back of the sanctuary during a midweek prayer service. Elias wasn't preaching. He was sitting in the front pew, alone, staring at the altar like he didn't recognize it. The congregation barely acknowledged him. Some turned away. Others pretended not to see. Afterward, a woman approached Detective Briggs quietly. She was an elder's wife. She handed over a USB drive and said, "My husband kept everything. Meetings, emails, all of it. We didn't know what to do, but I can't sleep anymore." On that drive were documents linking Elias to financial misconduct, personal messages with an unnamed choir member, and a series of calendar entries for unexplained late-night meetings. The walls were closing in. Back in the sanctuary, Elias knelt at the altar long after everyone left. He prayed, aloud this time, for forgiveness, for mercy, for escape. The sound of his voice echoed off the stained glass, hollow and raw. But mercy didn't come. The pressure mounted until one October night, during the tail end of a heavy rainstorm, Elias drove out past Cedarfield Lake, a place he and Lucas used to walk when they wanted to talk, without the fear of being seen. That night, it was empty, silent, except for the wind and the dripping trees. Hours later, a fisherman would find fresh tire tracks in the mud leading toward the woods. And 5 days after that, The smell near the water led park rangers to a shallow grave, barely covered, soaked by rain, surrounded by broken branches. Lucas Rivera's body was found curled against the base of a tree, his face unrecognizable, but his necklace still intact. The town changed overnight. The church closed indefinitely. News vans lined the street, and inside a police station, Elias Monroe sat under flickering fluorescent lights, staring at his mud-streaked hands, and finally whispered the words Detective Briggs had been waiting for. I didn't mean for it to happen, but it had, and nothing would ever be the same again. If this story has made you think, leave a like and tell us in the comments. Have you ever trusted someone who hid who they really were? Your opinion matters and can help others to see beyond appearances. Let's talk, because some truths only come out when we share them. Detective Caroline Briggs had seen her share of confessions. Some blurted in panic, others whispered through tears. But Pastor Elias Monroe's was different. There was no passion in his voice, no remorse that surfaced easily, just a slow, exhausted surrender. It wasn't what he said that made her lean in closer. It was what he didn't. I didn't mean for it to happen. Not, I didn't do it. Not, it was an accident. Just a vague, deliberate murmur that told her there was more buried than just a body in the woods. The forensic team processed the scene by Cedarfield Lake meticulously. The storm had washed away most footprints, but they found remnants, tire tracks, a torn scrap of Elias's church bulletin snagged on a branch, and a crushed phone charger half buried in the mud. It matched the make and model of the device Lucas used, the one missing since the day he disappeared. Back at the station, Briggs requested every digital file tied to Elias, phone records, GPS history, church emails. And from that pile, a surprising piece of evidence emerged. Lucas had created a backup email account, one that Elias didn't know existed. Within it, dozens of draft messages addressed to no one, never sent, but carefully written. In them, Lucas detailed his internal struggle. The secrecy, the guilt, the hope that Elias would one day choose him openly. But as time wore on, the drafts turned darker. He began to doubt Elias's promises. He referenced the motel visits, the payments, and, most crucially, a folder on a flash drive labeled Insurance. That drive hadn't been found at Lucas's apartment, but something clicked in Briggs's mind. Earlier, during her first walk through the church office, she had seen a locked filing cabinet in the back room. Elias had claimed it was used for archived baptism records. At the time, she didn't press, but now she was sure. With a warrant secured, she returned with a locksmith. Inside the cabinet, behind old files and dust-covered ledgers, was a small metal box. Inside the box, a flash drive labeled only with the letter L. What was on it shifted the entire case. Recordings. 2, to be exact. The first was audio only, Lucas reading a letter he had written but never sent. In it, he pleaded with Elias to stop hiding, to admit what they were, to stop using the church as a shield. He sounded tired, resigned. The second recording, however, was different. It wasn't addressed to Elias, it was addressed to whoever finds this. If anything happens to me, Lucas said, his voice shaking, I want you to know that I didn't plan it. I wasn't suicidal, I was scared. And I know Elias won't hurt me. He wouldn't, but just in case. Here's the truth. He then described everything. The relationship, the first time they kissed in the church's private prayer room, the hush money payments, the threats, and the final meeting planned at Cedarfield Lake. He gave dates, times, even mentioned the envelope he never planned to use. That file changed everything. It wasn't just about guilt anymore. Now, it was premeditation. Detective Briggs presented the new evidence to the district attorney's office within hours. By the next morning, Elias Monroe was officially charged with first-degree murder. The news broke faster than the church bells could toll. Local stations camped outside the courthouse. National outlets picked up the story by noon. Commentators debated everything, from the misuse of church funds to the moral implications of power and closeted desire in conservative communities. Inside New Bethel, the mood was heavy. The sanctuary remained locked. The welcome sign out front, once adorned with cheerful scriptures, now stood blank, letters removed as if to erase the memory. The congregation, once fiercely loyal, fractured overnight. Some defended Elias, clinging to the version of him they remembered. The man who baptized their children, married their siblings, prayed with them through cancer. Others couldn't look past the betrayal, the secrecy, the lie that sat in every sermon he'd ever preached about integrity and truth. At home, Ruth watched the news alone in a hotel room. Her phone buzzed constantly, reporters, friends, family. She didn't answer any of them. Instead, she opened her laptop and started a letter. Not to Elias, to Lucas, a young man she had never really met, but whose name had now become a wound stitched into the history of her life. She thanked him for trying to be honest, and she apologized for everything he endured. As the case moved toward trial, Caroline Briggs met one last time with Marcus Rivera. She handed him a copy of the flash drive. "I thought you should hear his voice again," she said. Marcus didn't speak. He just nodded, took the drive, and clutched it like it was something sacred. Detective Caroline Briggs wasn't one to get emotionally involved. In her 15 years on the force, she had worked homicides, domestic violence cases, missing persons. She'd seen what secrets could do to people, how shame could become a weapon, how silence could be more fatal than a bullet. But something about this case had gotten under her skin. Maybe it was the contrast. A man who had spent his life preaching about truth, grace, and redemption, now at the center of a murder trial that began with a hidden affair and ended in a shallow grave. There was something about that hypocrisy that made this case feel personal, and Briggs wasn't done. While the evidence gathered so far was damning, she knew how defense attorneys operated. They'd argue emotional manipulation, diminished capacity, even desperation. What she needed was consistency, a chain of behavior that showed Elias hadn't just cracked under pressure, but had manipulated every move leading up to Lucas's death. She went back to square one: interviews, emails, internal church communications. It was during a second visit to Ruth Monroe's temporary apartment that something unexpected surfaced. "I found this cleaning out our old desk," Ruth said, handing over a small notepad. "He used to jot sermon ideas in here." But what Briggs found inside wasn't scripture. It was a list, a series of coded initials, dates, and dollar amounts. It didn't take long to match some of them to known withdrawals from the church fund. But a few entries predated Lucas entirely. Different initials, smaller sums. It raised a disturbing possibility. Is it possible Lucas wasn't the first? Briggs asked herself. She tracked down one of the older initials, JT, linked to a former choir member who had left the church abruptly in 2010. His name was Jeremy Tate. A quick search found he now lived in Atlanta. She called. He hesitated to speak at first, but eventually agreed to meet. At a quiet diner off I-85, Jeremy confirmed it. "Yes, there was something," he said, eyes flicking toward the window. "It wasn't physical, not really. But he made me feel seen, special. Then when it got complicated, he pushed me out, said I was reading into things. 2 weeks later, I was gone." Jeremy never told anyone. Not his family, not the church board. But the pain in his voice told Briggs everything she needed to know. Elias Monroe had a pattern, and Lucas Rivera had been the one who didn't go quietly. With this new testimony, the case gained weight. Briggs submitted her findings to the prosecution team. The district attorney, Karen Pierce, a relentless figure in the courtroom, immediately restructured the case to reflect a broader narrative. Not just one crime, but a pattern of manipulation and abuse of power. Karen's strategy was clear: show that Elias had exploited his authority for years, that Lucas wasn't the first, just the one brave enough to demand accountability. The community response was swift. People who once held Elias on a pedestal began sharing uneasy memories. A mother recalled how uncomfortable her son felt during youth counseling sessions. A former deacon admitted he'd overheard a tense conversation between Elias and a male volunteer, but had ignored it out of respect or fear. It was like the floodgates opened. Meanwhile, Marcus Rivera wasn't sitting still either. Fueled by grief and anger, he began speaking out. On local podcasts, community panels, even interviews with journalists who picked up the story nationally. He didn't speak with rage. He spoke with clarity, with pain, and with purpose. "My brother was more than a scandal," Marcus said during one interview. "He was a person, a soul, and he deserved better than a secret." That simple line caught fire online. Thousands began to share the story, some with their own accounts of church abuse or manipulation. The narrative shifted. This wasn't just about one man's crime. It was about a system that allowed him to hide in plain sight. In the weeks leading up to the trial, Caroline Briggs sat at her desk late one night. The case file open, photos and transcripts spread out like puzzle pieces. She'd done her part, built the narrative, secured the evidence. But something still didn't sit right. She flipped through Lucas's last recording again. "I know Elias won't hurt me. He wouldn't." That hesitation, that sliver of doubt, the pause that implied trust, however fragile. It made her think, was there a moment, just before the end, when Elias could have chosen differently, when the trajectory could have been stopped? We'll never know. But what was certain now? The illusion of perfection had been shattered. The community was no longer praying blindly. They were demanding answers and justice. The trial was set. And this time, Elias Monroe wouldn't be behind the pulpit. He'd be in the defendant's chair, facing a town that finally saw him not as a prophet, but as a man. The first day of trial felt like a southern summer funeral, hot, quiet, and charged with the weight of unspoken truths. By the time the courtroom doors opened at the Harnett County Courthouse, there was already a line of spectators stretching down the block. Some were there out of loyalty. Others came for answers, and a few, though they'd never say it aloud, came just to witness the fall. Elias Monroe entered through a side door, escorted by deputies, dressed in a navy suit that hung looser than usual on his frame. He looked smaller somehow, diminished. His once confident stride had turned into cautious steps. His eyes, once so magnetic from the pulpit, now avoided contact. He didn't look like a murderer. That's what many people whispered, and that, perhaps, made it all more chilling. District Attorney Karen Pierce began her opening statement with calm precision. "This is not a case about faith. It is not about forgiveness. It is about accountability." The defendant, Elias Monroe, used his position of spiritual authority to manipulate, to conceal, and ultimately to silence a young man who threatened to reveal the truth. She moved through the evidence methodically, the messages, the payments, the confrontation at Cedarfield Lake. But the real power of her argument came not from what Elias did, but from the mask he wore while doing it. "Mr. Monroe stood in this community as a beacon of righteousness," she continued. "But behind closed doors, he orchestrated a life of lies. And when those lies were at risk of being exposed, he chose violence over truth." The defense, led by attorney William Cutler, presented a starkly different version. He framed Elias as a man under unbearable pressure, cornered by fear, by betrayal, by the impossible task of reconciling his inner turmoil with the expectations of a public role. "There was no premeditation," Cutler said. "There was no plan to kill. There was only a moment, charged with emotion, clouded by confusion, and a terrible, irreversible mistake." Cutler emphasized Lucas's threats, his instability, the supposed unpredictability of their final meeting. He described Elias as a man pushed past his limit, not a cold-blooded killer. The courtroom listened, silently, intensely. As witnesses took the stand, the story unfolded again, but this time in front of the people who had once called Elias their shepherd. Ruth Monroe testified with steady composure, her wedding band absent. She spoke of sleepless nights, unanswered questions, and the moment she found the receipts. "I asked him if he loved someone else," she said. voice low. He couldn't even say no. When asked if she believed he was capable of murder, she paused, then said, "I didn't want to, but I knew." Marcus Rivera's testimony was different, raw, shaking, filled with emotion he barely kept in check. He recounted Lucas's final months, the optimism, the affection, the growing anxiety. "He thought Elias would choose him," Marcus said, eyes locked on the man in the defendant's chair. He really believed that, right until the end. Then came the digital evidence. The flash drive was projected in court. Lucas's voice echoed through the speakers, filling the room with something heavier than silence. His truth. "If you're hearing this," the recording began, "then it means I was right to be scared." There were tears in the gallery. A few jurors looked away. Elias kept his head down, motionless. The prosecution's final move came with Detective Caroline Briggs on the stand. She laid out the timeline, the evidence trail, the pattern of behavior, the coded notepad. And then, with careful phrasing, she delivered her conclusion. This wasn't a loss of control. This was a decision. A series of decisions made by someone who knew exactly what he stood to lose, and who he was willing to silence to protect it. The defense cross-examined with vigor, trying to poke holes in motive, in timeline, in intention, but the jury wasn't swayed. In closing, Karen Pierce addressed them directly. Lucas Rivera was not a secret. He was a human being, a young man who believed in love, in faith, in the man who promised him both. And for that belief, he was buried in the dirt like he never existed. The jury deliberated for 8 hours. When they returned, the tension was so thick the bailiff had to clear his throat twice before asking for silence. The verdict, guilty of first-degree murder. Elias Monroe blinked once, but otherwise didn't move. The judge's sentencing came a week later. Life in prison without the possibility of parole. As the courtroom emptied, Marcus stood still for a moment, staring at the space Elias had occupied. Ruth exited quickly, her face unreadable. Reporters swarmed the steps outside. Flashbulbs snapped. Headlines wrote themselves. But inside the building, something far more quiet and profound had taken place. The mask had finally fallen, and what remained was not a monster, just a man who believed he could live a double life without consequence. A man who underestimated the courage of someone he thought he could control. Justice didn't feel like triumph that day. It felt like silence, like breath after holding it for too long. And for the first time in nearly a year, the town exhaled. The town of Lanesboro wasn't the kind of place that made headlines until it did. After the verdict was announced, the streets seemed quieter, the people more hesitant. There were no parades, no loud proclamations of justice served, just murmurs in parking lots and solemn nods between neighbors who didn't know how to process what had just happened. New Bethel Baptist Church, once the spiritual epicenter of the community, remained closed. Its windows were shuttered, the parking lot empty. The iconic sign out front, which used to display verses and community announcements, still read only one word: faith. But for many, that word now felt loaded, even painful. The church board resigned en masse 2 days after sentencing. No one wanted to lead a congregation built on a lie. There were whispers of revival under a new name, but nothing concrete. Some members sought other churches. Others walked away from organized religion entirely. A once unbreakable community had fractured. Local law enforcement was flooded with calls, not of emergency, but of gratitude. People thanked Detective Caroline Briggs for not letting the case die in silence. She didn't give interviews. She didn't want the spotlight. But in her quiet office, she allowed herself one long breath, one small moment of stillness before closing the case file for good. What she didn't expect was the letter. It arrived a week later. No return address. Inside was a handwritten note. "You did what nobody else would. Thank you for seeing my brother when others only saw shame." M.R. Briggs kept that letter in her drawer, beside her badge. Meanwhile, Marcus Rivera stood in the center of a media storm he never wanted. Interviews, podcasts, vigils. His voice had become the voice for those silenced by fear, secrecy, and abuse of power. But fame was never his goal. Justice was. He spoke at a university symposium on ethical leadership, sharing Lucas's story with professors and students who had once studied men like Elias Monroe as examples of moral excellence. He was a leader, yes, Marcus said, but leadership without integrity is just manipulation. His words resonated. Students stood and applauded. Not because he was a polished speaker, but because he was raw, honest in a way that no one in Lanesborough had dared to be for years. Ruth Munro left town shortly after the sentencing. No press conference, no formal statement, just a moving truck and silence. A former friend said she was staying with a sister in Asheville. Another said she was considering counseling. What was confirmed, she'd filed for divorce quietly, almost mechanically. She never returned to New Bethel. At the prison, Elias Monroe adapted quickly to the routine. He spent most days in the chapel, not leading services, but attending them, quietly, in the back, sometimes without speaking at all. The chaplain noted that Elias often requested solitude during reflection time. He never asked for special treatment. He didn't claim innocence, but he also never apologized publicly. One reporter managed a short interview months later. "Do you regret what happened?" they asked. Elias stared out the barred window for a long moment before answering. "I regret that I let fear define me." He never said Lucas's name. The community continued to reel. Families debated whether to keep their kids in youth ministries. Clergy across the county delivered sermons on accountability, on transparency, on the danger of unchecked power. Churches held forums, invited mental health professionals, initiated new codes of conduct for leadership roles. Lanesborough changed, not because it wanted to, but because it had to. Lucas Rivera's grave, a simple stone with his name and the words "loved, believed, remembered," became a place of pilgrimage for some, not just locals, people from nearby counties, even other states. Victims of similar situations, survivors, supporters, they left notes, guitar picks, sometimes just quiet prayers. The ripple effect extended far beyond that lakeside town. A documentary team approached Marcus a year later. He declined. He didn't want Lucas's story turned into entertainment. Instead, he started a foundation, the Lucas Initiative, focused on helping young people in faith communities navigate identity, mental health, and abuse recovery. Within a year, it had opened chapters in 3 states. One of the most powerful scenes happened far from cameras. It was a quiet evening, around dusk. A group of former New Bethel members gathered at Cedarfield Lake near the spot where Lucas had been found. There was no program, no pastor, no microphone, just candles floating on the water. They didn't speak much, but one woman, an elder who had once organized the church bake sales, whispered to the group, "He told the truth. That boy told the truth, and we owe him our ears now, even if we didn't give them then." She lit her candle and pushed it gently toward the water. Others followed, and for a few minutes the lake glowed, not from fire, from memory, from consequence, from change. It wasn't closure, not really, but it was the beginning of something different, and maybe that was enough. There are stories that stay with a community, not because of the crime itself, but because of what they reveal. The case of Elias Monroe wasn't just about one man's fall from grace. It was about the cost of silence, the power of image, and how dangerous it can be when trust is weaponized. For years, Elias was the symbol of moral clarity. People didn't just believe in his sermons, they built their lives around them. But the truth was never in what he preached. It was in what he hid. And when that truth surfaced, it forced an entire town to confront the uncomfortable possibility that righteousness can be faked and that faith without accountability can become a mask. Lucas Rivera wasn't perfect. He had doubts, made mistakes, and in his final days he struggled to protect himself. But he was honest, braver than most. He challenged a man adored by hundreds, not with violence, not with hatred, but with the quiet insistence that the truth mattered, even if it cost him everything. That's the real lesson. That truth, no matter how inconvenient or painful, cannot be buried forever. It finds its way through whispers, through questions, through the people who refuse to look away. What happened in Lanesborough showed how institutions can fail when loyalty is placed above truth, and how easily moral authority can turn into control. But it also revealed something else, something harder to see in the immediate aftermath: the power of one voice. Lucas didn't have a pulpit. He didn't have titles or influence. All he had was his story. And when he told it, when he left those messages, those recordings, he lit a match in the dark. The flame that followed burned away more than just lies. It illuminated the shadows where others had hidden for too long. This wasn't just a scandal. It was a reckoning for the church, for the town, for everyone who looked up to someone simply because of the robes they wore or the prayers they spoke. Faith isn't what you say when the room is full. It's who you are when no one's watching. And in the end, it wasn't a sermon or a verse that changed the course of this story. It was a young man's refusal to be erased. That is the legacy that remains, and that is what we remember. A year after the trial, Lanesborough was different. The church that had once dominated Main Street with its tall steeple and packed Sunday services now stood empty, its windows boarded, the front door chained. What remained was a physical shell of what had once been a spiritual giant. There were talks of converting the space into a community center, but no one had made a final decision. People still crossed the street to avoid walking too close, as if the building itself carried the weight of its past. Elias Monroe remains in state prison, serving a life sentence without parole. According to correctional staff, he spends most of his time in the prison chapel, not preaching, not leading, just sitting, reflecting. If he prays, it's silent. If he repents, no one knows. He has not granted another interview. His children have reportedly changed their last names and moved out of state. Ruth Monroe finalized her divorce 6 months after sentencing. She quietly sold their home and relocated to Asheville, where she started working as a counselor's assistant. In rare moments of conversation with old friends, she refers to that chapter of her life as before everything changed. She attends a small church now, where no one asks her about the past. Marcus Rivera took his grief and turned it into movement. The Lucas Initiative expanded rapidly, offering scholarships, mental health support, and confidential legal aid to young people navigating spiritual trauma and identity suppression. His face became familiar on national panels, but he never let it become about him. "This isn't about revenge," he said during one interview. "It's about making sure the next kid doesn't get swallowed by shame." He visits Lucas's grave every week, rain or shine, always alone, always in silence. As for the town, healing came slowly. Conversations that were once whispered behind closed doors are now held in community centers, in school auditoriums, in church basements trying to do better. New pastors took over smaller churches and made accountability a part of every leadership position. People who once dismissed emotional harm as weakness began to understand its consequences. And trust, so easily given before, became something people had to earn. Some still defend Elias quietly, some deny everything. But most understand now that what happened wasn't just the story of a pastor who sinned, it was the unraveling of a system that made it possible. Lucas's name isn't forgotten. It's etched into the walls of every youth group handbook rewritten, every policy updated, every parent who now asks better questions. And while no justice will ever bring him back, the echo of his voice, the voice of someone who chose truth over silence, continues to shape lives long after his was taken. Because stories like his don't end at the grave. They begin there. What do you believe would have happened if Lucas hadn't spoken up? If he hadn't left behind those recordings, those files, that quiet warning inside a locked drawer? Would Elias Monroe still be standing behind a pulpit today, preaching righteousness with a smile, while hiding the darkest parts of himself behind stained glass and scripture? This case doesn't just ask us to look at one man's crime. It forces us to look around, to ask hard questions. Who are we trusting without question? What truths are we ignoring because they make us uncomfortable? How many stories, like Lucas's, are still waiting to be heard? If this story shook you, made you pause, made you feel anger, grief, or even guilt, don't let it end here. Leave a comment below. Do you think justice was truly served? Or was it already too late? And more importantly, share your voice, your thoughts, your theories, because sometimes the most powerful thing we can do is refuse to stay silent. Hit that like button if you believe stories like this deserve to be told. Subscribe to the channel and turn on the notifications, because every week we bring you real stories that challenge what you thought you knew and remind you just how fragile truth can be. And finally, share this video with someone who believes in justice, someone who understands that behind every headline there's a human being whose voice deserves to echo, because Lucas's voice didn't end with his last breath. It continues here, with us, with you.